The Case of the Mourning Flowers, a Miss Jane Marple mystery as told by Connor. Hello dear listeners, I'm Connor, and tonight I have another remarkable tale to share about the extraordinary Miss Jane Marple. This particular story involves funeral flowers at a celebration, a literary society's golden anniversary, and a mystery that began with a simple observation that something beautiful can be terribly wrong. Now settle in comfortably, and let me tell you about the time Miss Marple encountered the most inappropriate floral arrangement in St. Mary Mead's history. Chapter 1. An Unusual Bouquet. It was a glorious Saturday morning in late September when the St. Mary Mead Literary Society prepared to celebrate their 50th anniversary. The venue chosen for this momentous occasion was Pemberton Manor, a magnificent Georgian estate whose gardens had hosted countless social gatherings over the centuries. The manor's current owners, Major William Pemberton and his wife Constance, had graciously opened their grounds for what promised to be the social event of the season. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, as was her custom for any event worth attending. She wore her best lavender dress with the small pearl brooch that had belonged to her mother, and carried her trusty black handbag containing the usual assortment of knitting needles, peppermints, and the small notebook she used for her observations of human nature. The gardens were indeed spectacular. Golden bunting stretched between ancient oak trees, their leaves just beginning to turn autumn colors. Round tables covered in crisp white linens dotted the lawn, each adorned with cheerful arrangements of yellow roses, orange marigolds, and russet chrysanthemums that perfectly captured the celebratory spirit of a golden anniversary. A small orchestra had set up near the ornamental pond, playing light classical pieces that drifted pleasantly across the grounds. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, taking in the scene with the thoroughness that had served her so well in previous investigations. She observed Mrs. Constance Pemberton directing the final arrangements near the refreshment tent, her anxiety barely concealed beneath a bright social smile. Major Pemberton stood near the manor's French doors, resplendent in his military dress uniform, greeting early arrivals with hearty handshakes and booming welcomes that seemed just a touch too enthusiastic. The Literary Society members were easily identifiable by their animated discussions of recent acquisitions and upcoming events. Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell, the Society's treasurer for the past 15 years, moved between groups with characteristic efficiency, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her blue silk dress lending her an air of dignified authority. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, the Society's resident expert on rare books, held court near the library display table, his thin fingers gesturing expressively as he described some recent authentication work to a rapt audience. Miss Catherine Thornbury, the Society's meticulous secretary, bustled about with her ever-present clipboard, checking arrangements against her detailed lists with the dedication of a military quartermaster. Her brown eyes, magnified slightly by wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing as she ensured every detail met the exacting standards the anniversary celebration deserved. It was then that Miss Marple noticed them. Near the refreshment tent, where golden anniversary decorations should have created an atmosphere of joy and celebration, stood the most elaborate funeral arrangements she had ever seen outside of an actual funeral parlor. Massive displays of white lilies dominated the space, their heavy fragrance competing with the scent of the celebration flowers. Chrysanthemums, traditionally associated with mourning, filled large standing arrangements tied with wide black ribbons that seemed to absorb the morning sunlight. Wreaths of white roses bore cards with gold lettering, though Miss Marple was too far away to read the messages. The contrast was jarring, almost surreal. It was as if someone had transported a corner of a funeral home into the middle of what should have been one of St. Mary Mead's most joyous occasions. Miss Marple approached the arrangements with the casual air of someone admiring the flowers, but her sharp eyes were taking in every detail. The flowers were fresh, professionally arranged and clearly expensive. These were not leftover arrangements from some other event, nor were they the result of a simple misunderstanding about color schemes. "Quite striking, aren't they?" came a voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to find Dr. Fairfax, his pale blue eyes studying the funeral arrangements with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. There was something in his manner that seemed less than surprised by their presence. "Indeed they are," Miss Marple replied carefully, "though I must confess, they seem rather unusual for a golden anniversary celebration." Dr. Fairfax adjusted his spectacles, a nervous gesture Miss Marple filed away for future reference. "Oh, I believe there was some confusion with the florist's delivery. These things happen, you know. I'm sure they'll be sorted out presently." But as Miss Marple watched Dr. Fairfax hurry away toward the library display, she noticed he glanced back at the funeral arrangements twice, and each time his expression grew more troubled. Moreover, she observed that several other society members were giving the flowers a wide berth, as if their presence made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Mrs. Pemberton approached the arrangements with a fixed smile that didn't reach her eyes, speaking in low, urgent tones to one of the uniformed servants about removing the inappropriate displays immediately. But when the servant moved to comply, Major Pemberton appeared as if from nowhere and stopped him with a sharp gesture, murmuring something about not causing a scene and dealing with it later. Miss Marple settled into a chair at a nearby table, ostensibly to rest her feet, but actually to maintain a clear view of the suspicious flowers and the people who reacted to them. She pulled out her knitting, a simple scarf that provided excellent cover for observation, and began to work while keeping her attention focused on the developing drama. Something was decidedly not right about those funeral arrangements, and Miss Marple's long experience with human nature told her that when something appeared this dramatically out of place, it was rarely by accident. Someone had ordered those flowers specifically for this occasion, and whoever it was had a reason that went far beyond simple florist error. As more guests arrived and the celebration officially began, Miss Marple continued her quiet observation, making mental notes about who avoided the funeral flowers and who seemed drawn to them. The morning was beautiful, the company was pleasant, and the anniversary celebration was getting underway in fine style. But those funeral flowers remained, like a dark omen hovering over what should have been a perfect day. Chapter 2: A Sudden Collapse. The celebration had reached its peak by 2 o'clock, with nearly 60 members and guests gathered on the Pemberton Manor grounds. The orchestra had switched to more lively pieces, and the sound of conversation and laughter created exactly the atmosphere the Literary Society had hoped for their golden anniversary. Miss Marple had positioned herself strategically near the refreshment tent, where she could observe both the continuing mystery of the funeral arrangements and the Society's planned program of speeches and presentations. Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell had been moving through the crowd with increasing excitement, her usual reserve giving way to an almost girlish enthusiasm that made her appear years younger than her 68 years. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm and frequently checked her watch, clearly anticipating some important announcement. When she stopped to speak with Dr. Fairfax near the library display, Miss Marple noticed her gestures were more animated than usual, and the doctor's responses seemed oddly subdued. Major Pemberton had taken on the role of master of ceremonies, his military bearing serving him well as he called for attention. The guests gathered in a loose semicircle around the small platform that had been erected near the ornamental pond, champagne glasses in hand and faces turned expectantly toward their hosts. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the St. Mary Mead Literary Society," Major Pemberton's voice carried clearly across the gardens, "we are gathered today to celebrate 50 remarkable years of literary appreciation, scholarly discussion, and community fellowship." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Hartwell had moved closer to the platform, her portfolio clutched more tightly, her face glowing with barely contained excitement. "Our society has weathered many changes over the decades," the Major continued, "but through it all we have maintained our commitment to the preservation and appreciation of literature in all its forms. Today, I am particularly pleased to call upon our treasurer, Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell, who has some very exciting news to share about our society's future." Mrs. Hartwell approached the platform with dignity, though Miss Marple could see the slight tremor in her hands as she opened her portfolio. The afternoon sun caught the silver threads in her hair, creating an almost luminous effect as she smiled out at her audience. "My dear friends and fellow literary enthusiasts," Mrs. Hartwell began, her voice strong and clear, "I have the most wonderful news to share with you today. Just last month, our society received an extraordinary donation that will secure our future for generations to come." She paused, clearly savouring the moment, while the audience leaned forward with interest. Even Miss Marple found herself drawn into the anticipation, though she maintained her awareness of the funeral arrangements that still dominated the refreshment area. We have been gifted with a first edition of Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield, authenticated by our own Dr. Fairfax, which has been valued at over £30,000. Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose with excitement. The anonymous donor has given us permission to sell this treasure, and the proceeds will establish an endowment fund that will... She stopped mid-sentence, her face suddenly pale. The portfolio slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the platform as she swayed dangerously. Evelyn Dr. Fairfax started forward, but Mrs. Hartwell was already falling, her body crumpling with a frightening finality that sent shocked gasps through the crowd. In the chaos that followed, Miss Marple's training in observation served her well. While others rushed forward with cries of alarm and offers of assistance, she remained in her chair, watching carefully as the drama unfolded. Major Pemberton took immediate charge, his military experience evident as he cleared space around the fallen woman, and sent someone to telephone for Dr. Haydock. Mrs. Pemberton appeared with cushions and a light blanket, her social hostess skills adapting quickly to this medical emergency. But Miss Marple was watching other reactions that revealed far more than the obvious ones. Dr. Fairfax had indeed moved toward Mrs. Hartwell, but his initial response had been oddly measured, as if he had been half expecting something to happen. Miss Thornbury stood frozen near the library display, her clipboard forgotten in her hands, her face registering what looked more like confirmation than surprise. Most intriguingly, someone had moved quickly to begin gathering the scattered papers from Mrs. Hartwell's portfolio. Miss Marple couldn't see clearly who it was through the crowd, but she observed the swift, purposeful movements of someone collecting specific documents rather than simply tidying up. As Dr. Haydock arrived and began his examination, determining that Mrs. Hartwell was unconscious but breathing steadily, Miss Marple noticed another curious detail. The funeral arrangements, which had been such a prominent and inappropriate feature of the celebration, were being quietly relocated. Under the cover of the medical emergency, 2 servants were moving the elaborate displays toward a service area behind the manor house. When she looked for Major Pemberton to see if he had ordered this action, she found him kneeling beside Mrs. Hartwell, apparently focused entirely on her welfare. But there was something in his posture, a tension that suggested his attention was divided between the medical crisis and something else entirely. Dr. Fairfax had retrieved his medical bag from his motorcar and was assisting Dr. Haydock with the examination. Their conversation was too quiet for Miss Marple to overhear, but she observed Dr. Fairfax's careful attention to Mrs. Hartwell's symptoms, almost as if he were confirming something he already suspected. "Looks like heat exhaustion," Dr. Haydock announced to the anxious crowd. The excitement, the warm afternoon, perhaps she didn't eat enough lunch. "We'll get her to hospital for observation, but I expect she'll be fine." Relief swept through the gathering, but Miss Marple noticed that not everyone looked relieved. Miss Thornbury remained pale and tense, continuously wringing her hands. Dr. Fairfax's assistant seemed overly solicitous, almost performative in its concern. As the ambulance arrived, and Mrs. Hartwell was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, still unconscious but stable, Miss Marple made her way toward the scattered papers that had been gathered up. Most had been collected already, but she managed to retrieve one sheet that had blown under a nearby table. It was a financial summary, covered in Mrs. Hartwell's neat handwriting, detailing recent transactions for the Literary Society's accounts. The figures were significant, and several entries had been marked with question marks in red ink, as if Mrs. Hartwell had been investigating discrepancies. The ambulance departed with its patient, taking with it much of the celebration's festive atmosphere. Guests began making polite excuses to leave, expressing hopes for Mrs. Hartwell's swift recovery, and compliments on the lovely party despite its unfortunate ending. As Miss Marple prepared to depart herself, she took one final look at the area where the funeral arrangements had been. All that remained were slight impressions in the grass where the heavy stands had rested, and a few stray white petals that had been overlooked in the hasty removal. Major Pemberton appeared at her elbow, his military courtesy intact despite the afternoon's disruption. "I do hope this unfortunate incident hasn't spoiled your enjoyment of our celebration, Miss Marple." Poor Evelyn, she's been working so hard lately on the society's finances. The stress must have caught up with her. Indeed, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though I must say, those funeral arrangements seemed rather ominous in retrospect, almost as if someone had been expecting bad news. Major Pemberton's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, well, as Dr. Fairfax mentioned, there was some confusion with the florist. These things happen, unfortunately. But as Miss Marple made her way home through the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that there had been nothing confused or accidental about those funeral flowers. Someone had known exactly what they were ordering, and when. The question was why. Chapter 3. The First Thread. The following morning brought one of those crisp, clear September days that make the English countryside particularly beautiful, but Miss Marple found herself less interested in the weather than in the mystery that had presented itself at yesterday's celebration. She had spent a restless night thinking about Mrs. Hartwell's collapse, those inappropriate funeral arrangements, and the various reactions she had observed from the Literary Society members. After her usual breakfast of toast and marmalade, Miss Marple decided that a walk through the village would be just the thing to clear her head and perhaps provide some additional information about yesterday's events. She was particularly interested in speaking with young Tommy Morrison, who worked for Meadowbrook Flowers and had been responsible for the delivery to Pemberton Manor. She found Tommy loading arrangements into the delivery van outside the flower shop, his cheerful whistling suggesting he was blissfully unaware of any controversy surrounding yesterday's delivery. "Good morning, Tommy," Miss Marple greeted him with her warmest smile. "I do hope you're not too busy this morning. I was at the Literary Society celebration yesterday and wanted to compliment you on those lovely arrangements." Tommy beamed with pride. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple. We worked extra hard on those golden anniversary pieces, though I must say, it was a bit odd getting that second order for the same address." Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though she maintained her casual demeanor. "Second order? How interesting." "Yes, well, we had all the celebration arrangements ready to go. Beautiful work, if I do say so myself. Yellow roses, orange marigolds, all very festive. But then Thursday afternoon, I got a call about additional arrangements for the same event. Special request, they said. White lilies, chrysanthemums, very formal, quite expensive, actually." Tommy paused in his loading to scratch his head thoughtfully. "The odd thing was, when I delivered them Saturday morning, Mrs. Pemberton seemed surprised to see them, almost upset, really. But the order was paid for in advance, cash no less, so I couldn't very well take them back." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Do you recall who placed the order for the funeral arrangements?" "That's just it, they weren't ordered as funeral arrangements. The order slip just said, formal white arrangements for literary celebration, but when I saw them all set up together, well, they did look rather like something you'd see at a service, didn't they?" Miss Marple agreed that they certainly had, and after a few more minutes of pleasant conversation about the flower business, she made her way toward the center of the village. Tommy's information had confirmed her suspicions. The funeral arrangements had been ordered separately, specifically for the celebration, and paid for in cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. Her next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Trimble was always delighted to discuss any interesting events in the village. The postmistress had an encyclopedic knowledge of local affairs, and a genuine fondness for Miss Marple's company. "Such a terrible thing about poor Mrs. Hartwell," Mrs. Trimble said immediately upon seeing her. "Though I must say, she's been looking rather strained lately. All that worry about the society's finances, I expect." "Oh," Miss Marple settled into the chair that Mrs. Trimble kept for visitors. "Has she been having difficulties?" "Well, I shouldn't really say, but she's been in here nearly every day this past month, sending registered letters to banks and such, always very secretive about it, but you could see she was troubled, and just last week she had me send a registered letter to some rare book dealer in London. Very urgent, she said." This was indeed interesting information. Mrs. Hartwell had been conducting some sort of financial investigation, sending official correspondence to banks and book dealers. Her announcement about the valuable donation at yesterday's celebration now took on additional significance. Miss Marple's next destination was the village library, where she hoped to learn more about rare book authentication and the process doctor.
Fairfax would have used to verify the Goldsmith first edition. Mrs. Bunting, the librarian, was delighted to assist with what she assumed was Miss Marple's developing interest in book collecting. Dr. Fairfax is certainly the expert in these matters, Miss Bunting explained as she pulled several reference books from the shelves. He's authenticated pieces for collectors throughout the county, though I must say, he's seemed rather preoccupied lately. Just last week he spent hours here researching paper aging techniques and historical binding methods. Quite technical stuff, really. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, Miss Marple, I wondered if he might be working on something special. He was particularly interested in 18th century printing methods and the chemical processes used to age documents artificially. Not the sort of research you'd expect from someone just authenticating existing pieces. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Bunting for her assistance and made her way home, her mind working to assemble the pieces of information she had gathered. Mrs. Hartwell had been investigating financial irregularities and corresponding with book dealers. Dr. Fairfax had been researching document aging and authentication techniques. The funeral arrangements had been ordered specifically for the celebration by someone who paid cash to avoid identification. That afternoon, she decided to pay a social call on Miss Catherine Thornbury, the Literary Society's secretary, whose behavior at yesterday's celebration had been particularly noteworthy. Miss Thornbury lived in a neat cottage on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by the sort of precisely maintained garden that reflected her methodical personality. She found Miss Thornbury in a state of considerable agitation, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat dishevelled, and her manner nervous to the point of distraction. "Miss Marple," she said, clearly surprised by the visit. "How kind of you to call. I do hope you weren't too disturbed by yesterday's unfortunate events." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into the offered chair in Miss Thornbury's sitting room. "Though I must confess, I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Hartwell. Have you heard how she's recovering?" Miss Thornbury's hands fluttered nervously as she served tea. "Dr. Haydock says she's stable, but they're keeping her for observation. Something about her symptoms being rather unusual for simple heat exhaustion." This was new information, and Miss Marple filed it away carefully. If Mrs. Hartwell's collapse hadn't been caused by heat exhaustion, what had caused it? "I noticed you seemed quite concerned yesterday," Miss Marple observed gently. "Had Mrs. Hartwell been unwell recently?" Miss Thornbury set down her teacup with a slight clatter. She'd been working very hard on the society's accounts. There were some discrepancies that she was trying to resolve. She was quite worried about them, actually. What sort of discrepancies? For a moment, Miss Thornbury seemed on the verge of saying more, but then she pressed her lips together firmly. "I really shouldn't discuss society business. I'm sure everything will sort itself out once Evelyn recovers." But as Miss Marple prepared to leave, Miss Thornbury caught her arm with trembling fingers. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers, "those funeral flowers yesterday, they weren't delivered by mistake, were they?" "What makes you say that, my dear?" Miss Thornbury's face crumpled with worry. "Because I saw the order form when it was placed, and I recognized the handwriting." Before Miss Marple could ask whose handwriting it was, Miss Thornbury seemed to realize she had said too much. She quickly ushered Miss Marple to the door with nervous apologies about having to prepare for an evening appointment. But as Miss Marple walked home through the gathering twilight, she carried with her the satisfaction of having found the first solid thread in the mystery. Someone in the Literary Society had ordered those funeral arrangements, and Miss Thornbury knew who it was. Mrs. Hartwell had been investigating financial discrepancies serious enough to require registered letters to banks and book dealers. Dr. Fairfax had been researching document aging techniques, and Mrs. Hartwell's collapse had not been caused by heat exhaustion. The funeral flowers, it seemed, had been more prophetic than anyone had realized. Chapter 4: Hidden Tensions. The next morning brought disturbing news from the hospital. Dr. Haydock telephoned Miss Marple personally, a courtesy he extended only when he valued someone's discretion and insight into village affairs. "I thought you should know, Miss Marple." His voice was grave over the telephone line. "Miss Hartwell's condition is more serious than we initially believed. Her symptoms are consistent with digitalis poisoning, foxglove, you know. Someone appears to have administered a carefully calculated dose. Miss Marple felt her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to cause a dramatic collapse. Precisely. She's stable now, but it was a near thing. The dosage suggests someone with knowledge of the plant's properties, enough to incapacitate without immediately killing. Though if we hadn't gotten her to hospital when we did, he left the sentence unfinished. After ending the call, Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating this development. Digitalis poisoning required specific knowledge and careful preparation. It also grew abundantly in many English gardens, including, she recalled, the extensive grounds of Pemberton Manor. Someone had deliberately poisoned Mrs. Hartwell, timing the dose to take effect during her important announcement about the rare book donation. She decided her next investigation should focus on the Goldsmith first edition that had been at the center of Mrs. Hartwell's planned announcement. A trip to the village's small but well-regarded bookshop seemed in order. Mr. Wickham, the elderly proprietor, greeted her with his usual enthusiasm for discussing rare books. "Miss Marple, how delightful. I don't suppose you're finally ready to start that collection of first editions we've discussed." "Actually, I'm curious about authentication processes," she replied. "I understand Dr. Fairfax recently authenticated a valuable Goldsmith first edition for the Literary Society." Mr. Wickham's expression grew thoughtful. "Ah yes, he mentioned that piece. Quite valuable, apparently, though I must confess I found his description rather curious when he stopped by to research comparable sales." "Curious in what way?" "Well, he was asking about market values for Goldsmith first editions but also about detection methods for forgeries. Specifically, he wanted to know how experts identify artificially aged paper and whether modern inks could be detected in supposedly historical documents." Mr. Wickham adjusted his spectacles. "It struck me as odd that someone authenticating a genuine piece would be so interested in forgery detection methods." Miss Marple thanked Mr. Wickham and made her way to her next destination, Pemberton Manor itself. She had decided that a social call to inquire about Mrs. Hartwell's health would provide an excellent opportunity to observe the scene of the crime more carefully. Mrs. Pemberton received her in the morning room, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "Such a terrible shock about poor Evelyn," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice lacking its usual confident tone. "William is beside himself with worry. He keeps saying he should have noticed she was unwell." "These things can come upon one suddenly," Miss Marple replied sympathetically. "Though I understand the doctors are optimistic about her recovery." Mrs. Pemberton's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "Yes, well, we can only hope. Though I must say, the timing was dreadful, just when she was about to announce that wonderful donation to the Society. The Goldsmith first edition. How exciting for the Society to receive such a valuable gift. Indeed, though, between you and me, Miss Marple, the whole business has been rather stressful. William has been so preoccupied with the authentication process, and then there were all those questions about the Society's finances." Mrs. Pemberton stopped abruptly, as if realizing she was saying too much. Miss Marple maintained her gentle, encouraging demeanor. "Questions about the finances? Oh, nothing serious, I'm sure. Just some discrepancies that Evelyn was investigating. You know how thorough she is about the accounts. William said it was probably just clerical errors, but she seemed quite concerned." After tea, Mrs. Pemberton offered to show Miss Marple the garden, clearly eager to change the subject. As they walked through the extensive grounds, Miss Marple made careful note of the various plantings. The herbaceous borders were magnificent, featuring an impressive array of traditional English garden plants. "What beautiful foxgloves," Miss Marple commented, pausing beside a substantial patch of the tall bell-shaped flowers in various shades of purple and white. Mrs. Pemberton glanced nervously at the plants. "Yes, they self-seed quite readily. William is always threatening to clear them out. He says they're dangerous to have around with so many visitors to the estate. Wise of him to be cautious, though they are lovely, and I understand they have fascinating medicinal properties." "Do they? I'm afraid I don't know much about such things. William handles all the gardening decisions." but Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Pemberton hurried them past the foxglove patch rather quickly, and her knowledge of the plant's properties seemed more extensive than she was willing to admit. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit Dr. Fairfax directly. She found him in his study, surrounded by books on paper analysis, ink chemistry and historical printing techniques. His greeting was cordial, but noticeably strained. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. I trust you weren't too disturbed by Saturday's unfortunate events." "Not at all, though I've been thinking about that remarkable book donation Mrs. Hartwell was announcing. How exciting to have authenticated such a valuable piece." Dr. Fairfax's pale eyes flickered with something that might have been anxiety. "Yes, well, authentication is always a complex process. One must be absolutely certain of provenance, paper composition, ink analysis, so many technical factors to consider. It must require considerable expertise. I imagine you've had to study forgery techniques extensively to recognize authentic pieces." "Indeed." His response was curt, and Miss Marple noticed perspiration on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the study. "One must understand how forgeries are created to properly identify them. And I suppose the reverse is also true. Understanding authentication methods would make one quite knowledgeable about creating convincing reproductions." Dr. Fairfax stood abruptly, moving to the window with his back to Miss Marple. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning." "Oh, nothing specific. I was simply thinking how specialized knowledge can be used in various ways, rather like how someone familiar with medicinal plants might understand both their healing properties and their more dangerous applications." When Dr. Fairfax turned back to face her, his expression was carefully controlled, but Miss Marple caught the flash of alarm in his eyes. "I'm afraid I must cut our visit short, Miss Marple. I have an appointment in the village." As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. Dr. Fairfax possessed both the knowledge to create convincing forgeries and the botanical expertise to prepare digitalist poison. Major Pemberton was facing financial difficulties that would make him susceptible to schemes involving valuable books. Mrs. Hartwell had been investigating discrepancies that threatened to expose whatever fraud was taking place. The funeral flowers were beginning to make terrible sense. Someone had ordered them as a macabre celebration of Mrs. Hartwell's anticipated death, confident that the digitalist would do its work during her moment of triumph. Only careful medical attention had prevented the flowers from serving their intended purpose. The question now was proving which members of this conspiracy had ordered those flowers, and whether Mrs. Hartwell would recover sufficiently to provide the evidence needed to expose the entire scheme.
Chapter 5. The Book Expert's Secret. 3 days after her visit to Dr. Fairfax, Miss Marple received an unexpected invitation to examine the famous Goldsmith first edition herself. The invitation came from Major Pemberton, who telephoned to suggest that as someone with an interest in literary matters, she might appreciate seeing the donation that had caused such excitement at the anniversary celebration. Miss Marple accepted graciously, though she suspected the Major's motives were less about sharing literary treasures and more about gauging how much she had learned about the Society's affairs. She prepared for the visit with particular care, packing her magnifying glass and a small notebook in her handbag alongside the usual assortment of items. She arrived at Pemberton Manor to find Major Pemberton waiting in his library, a room that clearly reflected both his military background and his appreciation for fine books. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes, many bearing the gilt insignia of various military units, while others appeared to be valuable literary works accumulated over generations. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come." The Major greeted her with the hearty manner that seemed slightly forced. "I thought you might enjoy seeing our literary treasure before it goes to auction." The book lay on a velvet cloth atop the library's central table, its leather binding glowing softly in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. It was indeed a beautiful specimen, The Vicar of Wakefield, in what appeared to be pristine condition for a work supposedly published in 1766. "How remarkable," Miss Marple murmured, leaning forward to examine the volume more closely. "May I?" "Of course, though do handle it carefully, Dr. Fairfax assures me it's quite fragile." Miss Marple lifted the book gently, immediately noting its weight and the texture of the leather binding. To her experienced touch, she had handled many old books in her lifetime. Something felt subtly wrong. The leather was perhaps too supple, the pages too crisp for a work of genuine antiquity. Dr. Fairfax's authentication was very thorough, I trust. Oh yes, absolutely meticulous. He examined the paper composition, ink analysis, binding techniques, everything one could possibly check. His report was quite comprehensive. Miss Marple opened the book carefully, studying the title page with her magnifying glass. The typography was certainly appropriate to the period, and the paper had the right texture and coloration for 18th century printing. Yet something nagged at her experienced eye. The condition is remarkable for such an old volume, she observed. One might almost think it had been carefully preserved under ideal conditions for centuries. Major Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. Yes, well, the previous owner was apparently quite meticulous about conservation, climate-controlled storage, minimal handling, that sort of thing. How fortunate. And this anonymous donor, Dr. Fairfax, was able to verify their ownership of the piece. Naturally, though they preferred to remain anonymous, their provenance documentation was entirely satisfactory. Miss Marple continued her examination, noting several details that struck her as inconsistent with genuine antiquity. The binding showed wear patterns that seemed artificially created, and certain pages displayed aging that appeared more chemical than natural. Most tellingly, her magnifying glass revealed what appeared to be modern thread in the binding, a detail that would escape casual inspection but was visible under close examination. Fascinating, she murmured. I don't suppose Dr. Fairfax mentioned the specific chemical processes he used to verify the paper's age. Major Pemberton's military posture stiffened slightly. I'm afraid the technical details are rather beyond my understanding. You'd have to ask him directly about such matters. Of course, though I understand he's been quite busy lately with various authentication projects. Mrs. Bunting at the library mentioned he'd been researching historical printing techniques quite extensively. Has she indeed? The Major's tone carried a note of displeasure. Village librarians do tend to be rather observant about their patrons' research habits. Miss Marple closed the book carefully and set it back on its velvet cloth. Thank you so much for allowing me to examine it. Such a valuable addition to the Society's assets. I do hope Mrs. Hartwell's recovery proceeds smoothly, so she can see the auction arrangements completed. Yes, well, these financial matters are rather complex. The Society may need to make alternative arrangements if Evelyn's recovery is prolonged. This was precisely the opening Miss Marple had been hoping for. Alternative arrangements. Dr. Fairfax has offered to handle the auction arrangements himself given his expertise in the field. And of course, as the venue for the authentication, I've offered to assist with any necessary documentation. Miss Marple maintained her pleasant expression while filing away this crucial information. Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton were positioning themselves to control the sale of what she now strongly suspected was an elaborate forgery. After leaving the manor, Miss Marple made her way directly to the village library, where she asked Mrs. Bunting to help her locate technical references on book authentication and forgery detection. Her examination of the Goldsmith edition had confirmed her suspicions, but she needed to understand the specific techniques that would have been required to create such a convincing fake. Goodness, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bunting exclaimed as she pulled several specialized volumes from the reference section. You're developing quite an interest in these technical matters, rather like Dr. Fairfax's recent research actually. Indeed, what specific aspects was he investigating? Mrs. Bunting consulted her circulation records. Paper aging techniques, particularly chemical methods for simulating centuries of natural deterioration. Ink composition analysis, how to match historical formulations using modern materials. Binding restoration, or rather how to create binding that appears to have been restored using period-appropriate methods. Each item on Mrs. Bunting's list confirmed another aspect of Miss Marple's growing theory. Dr. Fairfax hadn't been researching authentication techniques to verify genuine articles. He had been learning how to create forgeries sophisticated enough to pass expert examination. Most interesting was his research into provenance documentation. Mrs. Bunting continued. How to create convincing ownership histories for valuable items, including the proper aging of documents and seals. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon studying the technical references, learning about the complex processes required to create a convincing 18th century book using modern materials and techniques. The chemical aging of paper, the formulation of period-appropriate inks, the creation of authentic-looking binding ware, all were within the capabilities of someone with Dr. Fairfax's knowledge and access to specialized materials. That evening, she received a telephone call from Miss Thornbury, whose voice was strained with anxiety. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might speak with you privately. There are some things about the Society's recent affairs that I feel I must discuss with someone." They arranged to meet the following morning at Miss Marple's cottage, where Miss Thornbury arrived looking pale and thoroughly distressed. "I've been wrestling with my conscience," she began without preamble. "I know who ordered those funeral arrangements, and I believe I understand why." Miss Marple served tea and waited patiently while Miss Thornbury gathered her courage. "It was Major Pemberton," she said finally. "I saw him place the order at the flower shop, and when I questioned him about it, he said it was a joke, a reference to the death of the Society's financial worries once the book sale was completed. But you didn't believe that explanation, not after Evelyn collapsed. You see, Miss Marple, I've been helping her investigate discrepancies in the Society's accounts. Money has been disappearing, small amounts at first, but recently much larger sums, and the documentation for this valuable book donation, it doesn't exist." Miss Thornbury's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was no anonymous donor. Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton created that book themselves, intending to sell it and claim the money had been donated to the Society. Evelyn discovered the fraud and was going to expose them during her announcement." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrible clarity. The funeral flowers hadn't been a cruel joke, they had been a premature celebration of murder. Chapter 6: The Hidden Partnership. Miss Thornbury's revelation about the fraudulent book donation cast the entire conspiracy in a new and more sinister light. After her visitor departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating the full scope of what Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton had attempted. They had created an elaborate forgery, established false provenance, and when Mrs. Hartwell's investigation threatened to expose them, they had tried to silence her permanently. But Miss Marple's long experience with criminal behavior told her there were still missing pieces to this puzzle. The conspiracy seemed too elaborate for a simple embezzlement scheme, and Major Pemberton's financial motivations suggested something more desperate than mere greed. She decided that a discreet investigation of the Major's circumstances was in order. A visit to Mr. Blackwood at the village bank, ostensibly to discuss her own modest accounts, might provide insight into the financial pressures that had driven him to such desperate measures. Mr. Blackwood, who had managed the bank for over 20 years, was discretion itself in professional matters, but his long friendship with Miss Marple allowed for certain confidential conversations. "I'm afraid I can't discuss specific account details," he said after Miss Marple had delicately broached the subject of local financial difficulties, "but I will say that maintaining a property like Pemberton Manor in these times requires considerable resources. The upkeep costs alone." He shook his head sympathetically. "Some of our long-established families are finding it increasingly difficult to meet their obligations. Property taxes, maintenance, staff costs, it all adds up rather quickly. I imagine Major Pemberton faces such challenges with that lovely old manor." "Indeed, and with limited income from his military pension, well, let's just say that creative solutions become necessary." Miss Marple thanked Mr. Blackwood for his time and made her way to her next destination, the village records office, where property transactions and legal documents were maintained. If Major Pemberton was facing serious financial difficulties, there might be evidence of attempts to mortgage or sell portions of his estate. Mrs. Fletcher, the records clerk, was happy to assist with what Miss Marple described as genealogical research into local property histories. "The Pemberton estate has been in the family for generations," Mrs. Fletcher explained as she pulled the relevant files. "Though there have been several recent mortgage applications and inquiries about subdivision possibilities, the documents revealed a troubling pattern. Major Pemberton had mortgaged the property multiple times over the past 5 years, each loan secured against different portions of the estate. Most recently, he had applied for a substantial loan that had been denied due to insufficient collateral. Rather desperate circumstances," Mrs. Fletcher observed quietly.
The estate is heavily leveraged, and from what I understand several payments are overdue. This information provided the crucial context Miss Marple had been seeking. Major Pemberton wasn't simply greedy, he was facing financial ruin. The Literary Society's funds would have provided temporary relief, but the sale of a £30,000 book would solve his problems entirely. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to observe the partnership between Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton more directly. She positioned herself in the village tea shop, which offered an excellent view of the street leading to Pemberton Manor, and settled in with her knitting to wait. Her patience was rewarded when she observed Dr. Fairfax making his way toward the manor, carrying a leather satchel that appeared to contain documents or materials. His furtive manner and frequent glances around suggested this was not a social visit. Miss Marple waited a reasonable interval, then made her own way to the manor, approaching through the public footpath that ran along the edge of the property. The path provided access to the estate's kitchen garden and outbuildings, areas where she might observe without being noticed. She found a position behind the greenhouse that offered a view into the manor's library through the tall windows. What she saw confirmed her suspicions about the ongoing conspiracy. Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton were working together at the library table, examining what appeared to be additional books and documents. The leather satchel lay open, revealing bottles of chemicals, aging solutions and various tools that could only be used for document manipulation. Most damning was the sight of several partially completed forgeries scattered across the table. It appeared that the Goldsmith first edition was not their only fraudulent creation. They had been systematically producing fake rare books, presumably planning to donate them to the Literary Society, and then arrange for their sale. Miss Marple watched as Dr. Fairfax demonstrated techniques for artificially aging paper, using chemical solutions to create the brown spots and yellowing that would suggest centuries of natural deterioration. Major Pemberton appeared to be learning these methods himself, no doubt planning to continue the operation even if suspicion fell on his partner. Their conversation was too distant to overhear clearly, but their body language suggested tension and disagreement. Dr. Fairfax appeared agitated, gesturing emphatically towards some documents, while Major Pemberton's military bearing remained rigid with what looked like suppressed anger. Suddenly, Miss Thornbury appeared at the library door, clearly unexpected by both men. Miss Marple watched as their guilty scramble to conceal the evidence confirmed that Miss Thornbury was not a willing participant in their scheme but rather someone they were attempting to manipulate or intimidate. The secretary's distressed exit from the library a few minutes later suggested that the confrontation had not gone well for any of the parties involved. Miss Marple made her way back to the footpath, her mind racing with the implications of what she had observed. The partnership between Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton was more extensive than she had initially realized. They had been systematically defrauding the Literary Society through a series of fake donations, using the Major's respectable position and the Doctor's technical expertise to create an ongoing source of income. Mrs. Hartwell's investigation had threatened to expose not just one fraudulent book, but an entire operation that had been running for months or possibly years. Her poisoning hadn't been simply an attempt to prevent one exposure, it had been a desperate act to protect a criminal enterprise that represented Major Pemberton's only hope of avoiding financial ruin. But Miss Marple's observations had also revealed something else: cracks in the partnership that suggested the criminals were becoming desperate and careless. Dr. Fairfax's agitation and Major Pemberton's obvious anger indicated that the pressure of maintaining their deception was taking its toll. In Miss Marple's experience, this was often when criminals made the mistakes that led to their downfall. The funeral flowers had been one such error, a premature celebration that had drawn attention to their crime rather than concealing it. She suspected that more mistakes were coming, and when they did, she would be ready to ensure that justice was finally served. The question was whether Mrs. Hartwell would recover sufficiently to provide the testimony needed to expose the full extent of the conspiracy, or whether Miss Marple would need to find another way to prove what she now knew with moral certainty. Either way, she was determined that Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton would answer for their crimes, both the fraud they had committed and the attempted murder they had nearly accomplished. Chapter 7. A Desperate Gamble. The pattern of deception was now crystal clear to Miss Marple, but proving it would require more than her careful observations and logical deductions. She needed evidence that would stand up in court, and more importantly she needed to prevent Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton from continuing their criminal enterprise, or making another attempt on Mrs. Hartwell's life. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the disastrous anniversary celebration, Miss Thornbury appeared at her cottage in a state of complete panic. "Miss Marple," she gasped, barely waiting for the door to open, "they're planning to move the book tonight. Dr. Fairfax telephoned this morning to say they've found a buyer in London, someone willing to purchase immediately without waiting for a formal auction." Miss Marple ushered her distressed visitor into the sitting room and provided tea while Miss Thornbury explained the urgency of the situation. "They want me to prepare all the society's documentation this afternoon, claiming the buyer insists on immediate transfer of ownership. But Miss Marple, if that book leaves St. Mary Mead, we'll never be able to prove it's a forgery." And with Mrs. Hartwell still in hospital, she wrung her hands desperately. "Have they explained why such haste is necessary?" "Dr. Fairfax claims the buyer is leaving for America next week and wants to complete the transaction before his departure. But I think they're simply desperate to convert the book to cash before anyone else can examine it closely." Miss Marple considered this development carefully. The criminal's desperation was indeed showing, but it also presented an opportunity. If they were rushing to complete their fraud, they would be more likely to make crucial mistakes. "My dear Miss Thornbury," she said gently, "I believe the time has come to take decisive action, but I shall need your help, and you must be prepared to show considerable courage." Miss Thornbury straightened her shoulders with determination. "I'm ready to do whatever is necessary. I can't bear to see them succeed after what they did to poor Evelyn." Miss Marple outlined her plan carefully. Miss Thornbury would proceed as requested, preparing the documentation for the book sale, but she would also ensure that certain additional people were present for the transaction. Most importantly, she would insist that the Society's president, Colonel Bantry, be present to authorize such an unusual emergency sale. "But won't that alert them to our suspicions?" "On the contrary, it will appear entirely proper. No treasurer, even an acting one, should authorize such a significant transaction without the president's approval. Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton can hardly object to following proper procedures without revealing their guilt." Miss Marple also asked Miss Thornbury to telephone Dr. Haydock and request that he attend the meeting as a witness, ostensibly because of concerns about the Society's legal liability given Mrs. Hartwell's absence. Finally, she suggested that Inspector Slack be informed about the unusual evening meeting, though without explicitly stating suspicions of criminal activity. "You must be very careful not to accuse anyone directly," Miss Marple warned. "Simply present the meeting as unusual enough to warrant official observation. Inspector Slack's natural suspicion will do the rest." That afternoon, Miss Marple made her own preparations. She visited the village photographer and arranged for him to be in the vicinity of Pemberton Manor that evening, ostensibly to take some atmospheric shots of the historic building by moonlight. She also stopped by the post office to send a telegram to a rare book expert in London, requesting urgent authentication services. As evening approached, Miss Marple positioned herself in the manor's garden, concealed among the rose bushes that provided an excellent view of the library windows. She had arrived early enough to observe the conspirators' final preparations. Through the tall windows, she could see Dr. Fairfax arranging his forged Goldsmith edition alongside what appeared to be additional fake volumes. Major Pemberton was pacing nervously, occasionally pausing to examine documents that Miss Marple suspected were falsified provenance papers. Their body language revealed the strain they were under. Dr. Fairfax's usually precise movements had become jerky and anxious, while Major Pemberton's military bearing showed cracks of desperation. They were clearly aware that this represented their last chance to profit from their elaborate deception. At 7 o'clock, Miss Thornbury arrived with Colonel Bantry, whose expression suggested he was less than pleased about being summoned for an emergency meeting. Dr. Haydock followed shortly after, carrying his medical bag, and looking curious about the unusual circumstances. Miss Marple moved closer to the library windows, positioning herself where she could observe the meeting while remaining concealed in the garden shadows. The French doors were slightly open to admit the evening air, allowing her to hear portions of the conversation inside. "I must say, this is all rather irregular," Colonel Bantry was saying in his authoritative voice. "Emergency sales of society assets should be properly advertised and conducted through established auction houses."
Dr. Fairfax's response was smooth but carried an undertone of strain. "Under normal circumstances, I would entirely agree, Colonel. However, this buyer is offering substantially above the estimated value, and his departure for America makes delay impossible." "And where exactly is this mysterious buyer?" Dr. Haydock inquired. "Shouldn't he be present for such a significant transaction?" Major Pemberton stepped forward with what Miss Marple recognized as his command voice, though it lacked its usual confidence. "Richardson is waiting at the railway station. He preferred to examine the book privately before completing the purchase, given the substantial sum involved." Miss Marple noted that they had invented a specific name for their fictional buyer, suggesting they had prepared for questions about his identity, but their nervousness was evident in small details. Dr. Fairfax's hands trembled slightly as he handled the forged book, and Major Pemberton kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting unwanted observers. The meeting proceeded with Dr. Fairfax presenting his authentication documents, and Major Pemberton providing what he claimed were the donor's original papers. Miss Thornbury played her role perfectly, asking careful questions about procedures while appearing to support the emergency sale. It was then that Inspector Slack arrived, his presence causing visible alarm among the conspirators. "Inspector," Major Pemberton managed, his military training helping him maintain composure, "what brings you to the manor this evening?" "Routine inquiry about unusual evening activities," Slack replied brusquely. "Received reports of valuable items being moved under irregular circumstances. Thought I'd better have a look." Miss Marple smiled to herself from her hiding place. Inspector Slack's natural suspicion was serving exactly as she had hoped. The inspector's presence would make it impossible for the criminals to complete their transaction quietly. Dr. Fairfax made a desperate attempt to maintain the deception. "Inspector, we're simply conducting a properly authorized sale of literary society assets. All documentation is in order." But Inspector Slack was examining the books with the methodical attention that made him effective despite his sometimes abrasive manner. "Funny thing about rare books," he mused. "Had a case once involving forgeries. Amazing what criminals can do with modern chemistry and a bit of know-how." The effect on Dr. Fairfax was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and he moved instinctively to protect the books from closer examination. "I hardly think such suspicions are warranted," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. It was at this moment that Miss Marple decided the time had come for her own entrance. She made her way to the French doors and stepped into the library, her timing calculated to maximum effect. "Good evening, everyone," she said pleasantly. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The expressions on Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton's faces confirmed that her arrival was the last thing they had wanted. Their carefully orchestrated deception was crumbling, and Miss Marple's presence suggested that someone had been observing their activities far too closely. The final confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 8. The confrontation begins. Miss Marple's entrance into the library created a moment of electric tension that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Fairfax stood behind the table displaying his forged books like a guilty schoolboy caught in mischief, while Major Pemberton's military posture had become rigid with barely controlled panic. "Miss Marple," Colonel Bantry said with obvious relief, "how fortuitous. Your timing is excellent. We're dealing with some rather unusual circumstances regarding society business." "Indeed I am aware of the circumstances, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, settling herself into a chair with the unhurried manner that had unnerved many criminals over the years. "In fact, I believe I can shed some light on several mysterious aspects of recent events." Inspector Slack looked up from his examination of the books with interest. "Oh, what sort of light would that be?" Miss Marple opened her handbag and withdrew the small notebook she had been using to record her observations. "Well, Inspector, it began with those funeral flowers at last Saturday's celebration. Such an odd choice for a golden anniversary, don't you think?" Dr. Fairfax attempted to interrupt. "Miss Marple, I hardly see how floral arrangements are relevant to our current business transaction." "Oh, but they are extremely relevant, Dr. Fairfax," she continued pleasantly. You see, those flowers weren't delivered by mistake at all. They were ordered specifically for that date, paid for in cash, and placed exactly where they would be most visible during Mrs. Hartwell's announcement. Major Pemberton's face had taken on a greyish pallor, but he maintained his authoritative voice. "I'm afraid I don't follow your reasoning, Miss Marple. The reasoning becomes clear when one considers the timing, Major. Someone knew that Mrs. Hartwell would collapse during her announcement, and they ordered funeral arrangements as a rather macabre form of celebration. The flowers were meant to commemorate not a death that had occurred, but one that was planned." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Hartwell's collapse was deliberately caused?" "I'm afraid so, Doctor. She was poisoned with digitalis, foxglove extract, timed to take effect during her moment of triumph when she announced the Society's valuable book donation." Miss Thornbury gasped, though Miss Marple suspected her surprise was somewhat theatrical for the benefit of the criminals. Colonel Bantry's expression had grown thunderous. "Poisoned? Good God, that's attempted murder." "Indeed it was, Colonel. But the motive becomes clear when one examines what Mrs. Hartwell had discovered about the Society's finances." Miss Marple consulted her notebook. She had been investigating discrepancies in the accounts corresponding with banks and book dealers, because she suspected that the valuable donations the Society had been receiving were not genuine. Dr. Fairfax made another desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. "This is all very interesting speculation, Miss Marple, but we have a legitimate business transaction to complete. With Mr. Richardson at the railway station," Miss Marple's voice carried a note of gentle amusement, "I took the liberty of checking with the station master, Dr. Fairfax. No one by that name has purchased a ticket to London tonight. In fact, no one by that name has been through St. Mary Mead Station all week." The effect of this revelation was immediate. Major Pemberton's military discipline finally cracked, and he sank into a chair with his head in his hands. "Doctor." Fairfax's pale eyes darted desperately around the room, seeking escape routes that didn't exist. Inspector Slack had been listening with growing interest, and now he took charge of the situation with typical efficiency. "Right then, Miss Marple, I think you'd better explain exactly what you've discovered." Miss Marple arranged her notes carefully. "The scheme was quite elaborate, Inspector. Dr. Fairfax, using his expertise in book authentication, had been creating sophisticated forgeries of rare books. Major Pemberton, facing severe financial difficulties with the manor, provided the respectable venue, and helped establish false provenance for these fake donations to the Literary Society." She turned to address Dr. Fairfax directly. "Your research at the library gave you away, I'm afraid. Mrs. Bunting kept excellent records of your interests in paper aging techniques, ink composition, and artificial document aging. You weren't learning to authenticate genuine books, you were learning to create convincing forgeries." Dr. Haydock examined the Goldsmith first edition with his magnifying glass. "Now that I look closely, the binding does seem unusually well preserved for a work of this supposed age." "Precisely, Doctor. The book is a masterful creation, but it's entirely modern." Dr. Fairfax used authentic 18th century paper, probably harvested from genuine but less valuable period documents, and formulated inks that would pass chemical analysis. The binding was artificially aged using techniques he researched quite thoroughly. Colonel Bantry's voice was tight with anger. "And they intended to sell this forgery using the Society's reputation for authenticity. More than that, Colonel, this appears to have been an ongoing operation. I suspect examination of the Society's recent acquisitions will reveal multiple fraudulent donations, each authenticated by Dr. Fairfax, and each subsequently sold for substantial sums that went into private pockets rather than Society coffers." Major Pemberton finally raised his head, his face displaying the defeated expression of a man whose desperate gamble had failed utterly. "The manor. I couldn't lose the estate. My family has lived here for 6 generations, so you decided to steal from the Literary Society to pay your debts." Inspector Slack's voice carried no sympathy. Dr. Fairfax made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "You can't prove any of this. The book's authentication is thorough, the documentation is complete. Actually, Dr. Fairfax, I can prove it quite easily," Miss Marple interrupted. "You see, I sent a telegram to Sotheby's rare book department this afternoon, asking them to send an expert to examine this Goldsmith edition.
Mr. Whitman should be arriving on the late train tonight. The color drained completely from Dr. Fairfax's face. An independent expert examination would expose his forgery immediately, and everyone in the room knew it. Miss Thornbury, who had been watching the proceedings with fascination, finally broke her silence. "There's something else, Miss Marple. I found additional forged books in Dr. Fairfax's study yesterday, at least 6 other volumes, all supposedly rare first editions." This revelation was the final straw. Dr. Fairfax slumped in his chair, his elaborate deception crumbling completely around him. Inspector Slack stood up with satisfaction. "Right then, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, Major William Pemberton, I'm arresting you both on charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted murder. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." As the inspector began the formal arrest procedures, Miss Marple reflected on how the criminals' own arrogance had led to their downfall. The funeral flowers, meant as a secret celebration of their anticipated success, had instead drawn attention to their crime and provided the first thread that unraveled their entire conspiracy. Justice, it seemed, had a way of turning criminals' cruel jokes against them. Chapter 9. The Complete Deception. With Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton under arrest, Inspector Slack requested that Miss Marple provide a complete explanation of the conspiracy for his official report. The library at Pemberton Manor, scene of so much deception, now became the setting for the revelation of truth. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her notebook open, and began to reconstruct the entire criminal enterprise with the methodical precision that had made her such a formidable opponent of wrongdoers. The scheme began, I believe, with Major Pemberton's increasingly desperate financial situation, she explained to the assembled group. The manor required extensive repairs, property taxes were mounting, and his military pension was insufficient to meet these obligations. Bank records will show multiple mortgage applications and mounting debts. Colonel Bantry shook his head sadly. "William, you should have come to the society for help. We could have arranged something." "Pride, Colonel," Miss Marple observed gently. Military pride prevented him from admitting failure, so he sought what seemed like a clever solution. He approached Dr. Fairfax with a proposition: use the doctor's reputation for book authentication to create valuable donations that could be sold for the society's benefit, with a substantial portion diverted to solve the Major's financial problems. Inspector Slack was taking detailed notes, and Dr. Fairfax went along with this. Dr. Fairfax saw an opportunity for ongoing profit. Inspector. His research into authentication techniques had taught him exactly how forgeries could be created and detected. He realized he could use this knowledge in reverse, creating forgeries sophisticated enough to fool other experts. Miss Marple opened the forged Goldsmith edition to demonstrate her points. The process was remarkably thorough. Dr. Fairfax obtained genuine 18th century paper by purchasing damaged or incomplete period documents at estate sales. He studied historical ink formulations and created chemically accurate reproductions using modern materials. The typography was reproduced using letterpress techniques with period-appropriate fonts. Dr. Haydock examined the book's binding with professional interest, and the aging process. Multiple techniques. Dr. Chemical staining to simulate age spots and foxing, mechanical stress to create appropriate wear patterns, exposure to controlled heat and humidity to simulate centuries of environmental effects. The binding was particularly clever. He used period leather and thread, then employed chemical accelerants to create realistic deterioration. Miss Thornbury had been listening with fascination, but how did they establish provenance for the books? That was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their deception, Miss Marple replied. Dr. Fairfax created entire fictional histories for each book, complete with forged ownership documents, auction records, and authentication certificates from non-existent experts. He even aged the paper for these documents using the same techniques employed on the books themselves. She turned to address the specific case that had exposed their crime. The Goldsmith first edition was to be their masterpiece, valuable enough to solve Major Pemberton's immediate financial crisis while establishing the society as a recipient of extraordinary donations. They invented an anonymous donor who supposedly wished to remain unnamed for tax purposes. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes, and Mrs. Hartwell discovered the fraud. Mrs. Hartwell was far too thorough an accountant to be deceived by their false documentation. Inspector. Her correspondence with banks and book dealers revealed discrepancies in the Society's recent transactions. She discovered that several previous donations had been sold for amounts far exceeding what the Society had received. Miss Marple's voice grew grave as she addressed the attempted murder. When Mrs. Hartwell announced her intention to reveal her discoveries at the anniversary celebration, Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton realized their entire operation would be exposed. They decided to eliminate her. The digitalis came from the Manor's garden. Yes, Inspector. Both men had sufficient botanical knowledge to recognize foxglove and understand its properties. The timing was calculated precisely. Mrs. Hartwell would collapse during her moment of triumph, creating maximum confusion and preventing her revelations. Dr. Haydock's expression was grim. If we hadn't gotten her to hospital immediately. Indeed, Doctor. The dosage was intended to be fatal, but disguised as heart failure brought on by excitement and exertion. Without immediate medical intervention, their plan would have succeeded. Miss Marple consulted her notebook again. The funeral flowers were Dr. Fairfax's idea, a macabre joke celebrating what they believed would be Mrs. Hartwell's death and their own success. Major Pemberton ordered them using cash to avoid creating a paper trail, but their inappropriate presence at a celebration made them memorable to witnesses. She looked around the room at the assembled faces. What they failed to consider was that such an elaborate deception required perfect execution at every level. Mrs. Hartwell's survival, the conspicuous funeral arrangements, Dr. Fairfax's suspicious research activities, Major Pemberton's obvious financial desperation, each element created questions that demanded investigation. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with satisfaction, and their desperation tonight made them careless. Inventing a fictional buyer, rushing the sale without proper procedures, they practically confessed their guilt through their actions. Precisely, Inspector. Criminals often defeat themselves through their own cleverness. They become so focused on the technical aspects of their deception that they overlook the human elements that ultimately expose them. Miss Thornbury raised her hand tentatively. Miss Marple, how many other books do you think they forged? I suspect investigation will reveal at least 6 additional fraudulent donations over the past 18 months, Miss Thornbury. The Society's recent financial record should show a pattern of valuable acquisitions followed by sales that returned only partial proceeds to the organization's accounts. Colonel Bantry's face was red with indignation. The audacity of it. Using the Society's reputation to legitimize their criminal enterprise. Indeed, Colonel, they exploited the trust and respect that institutions like the Literary Society depend upon. Dr. Fairfax's reputation for expertise and Major Pemberton's social standing provided perfect cover for their activities. As if summoned by her words, the sound of a motor car arriving at the manor announced the arrival of Mr. Whitman from Sotheby's. The independent expert's examination would provide the final proof needed to support the criminal charges. Miss Marple gathered her notes and prepared to leave the scene to Inspector Slack's efficient handling. The criminals had been caught, their method exposed, and justice would follow its proper course. But she remained troubled by one thought. How many other respected community figures might be using their positions to exploit the trust of organizations like the Literary Society? The techniques Dr. Fairfax had employed could be replicated by anyone with sufficient knowledge and desperation. It was a sobering reminder that in a world where expertise could be counterfeited as convincingly as rare books, vigilance and skepticism remained essential virtues, even in the most respectable circles of society. Chapter 10. Justice and Reflection. 3 weeks later, Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the autumn sunshine, and reflecting on the satisfactory resolution of what the local newspaper had dubbed the Literary Society fraud. The Morning Post had brought a letter from Mrs. Hartwell, now fully recovered, and back in her own home, expressing heartfelt gratitude for Miss Marple's intervention. The official investigation had confirmed every aspect of Miss Marple's deductions. Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton had indeed created at least 7 fraudulent rare books over 18 months, stealing nearly £12,000 from the Literary Society in the process. The independent expert from Sotheby's had required less than an hour to identify the sophisticated forgeries, confirming that while technically impressive, they would never have survived professional scrutiny. Dr. Fairfax had eventually confessed to the entire scheme, perhaps hoping that cooperation might reduce his sentence. His statement revealed the full extent of their planning, the careful research into authentication techniques, the acquisition of period materials, the creation of false provenance documents, and finally the desperate decision to poison Mrs. Hartwell when her investigation threatened. Major Pemberton's confession had been more reluctant, his military pride making it difficult to admit the depth of his financial desperation. However, faced with overwhelming evidence and his partner's complete admission, he too had acknowledged his role in the conspiracy. His sentencing had taken into account his previous military service, but the judge had been clear that financial difficulties could not excuse fraud and attempted murder. The funeral flowers which had started Miss Marple on her investigation had proved to be crucial evidence. The florist's records showed that Major Pemberton had indeed ordered them specifically for the anniversary celebration, paying cash and requesting delivery at the exact time Mrs. Hartwell was scheduled to make her announcement. The prosecution had used this evidence to demonstrate the premeditated nature of their crime. Miss Marple's peaceful mourning was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Bantry, who had requested permission to thank her personally for her role in exposing the fraud and saving Mrs. Hartwell's life. "Miss Marple," he said as she served tea in her garden, "I don't know how we can ever adequately express our gratitude. If you hadn't noticed those inappropriate flowers and followed your instincts." "Think nothing of it, Colonel," she replied modestly. "I simply observed what was there to be seen. The criminals defeated themselves through their own arrogance and cruelty. But your insight into human nature, seeing through their deception when the rest of us were completely fooled, that was remarkable." Miss Marple poured tea thoughtfully. "I'm afraid I have an advantage in these matters, Colonel. You see, I've spent many years observing people in this village, and I've learned that beneath the surface of respectability, human nature remains quite consistent. Greed, desperation and pride drive people to extraordinary acts both noble and criminal." She gestured toward her cottage garden, where late roses bloomed alongside the foxgloves that had provided the poison for Mrs. Hartwell's near-fatal dose. "Just as these plants can be beautiful and dangerous simultaneously, people often present respectable appearances while harboring dark intentions." Colonel Bantry nodded gravely. "Dr. Fairfax seemed so scholarly, so dedicated to preserving literary heritage. And William, I've known him for 20 years. His military service, his standing in the community, precisely why their scheme was so effective initially," Miss Marple observed. "They exploited the trust that comes with expertise and social position. People assumed that Dr. Fairfax's authentication was reliable because of his reputation, and that Major Pemberton's involvement guaranteed legitimacy." "How did you first suspect them?" Miss Marple smiled at the memory. "Those funeral flowers were simply too coincidental, Colonel. In my experience, when something appears dramatically out of place, it's rarely by accident. Someone had ordered expensive funeral arrangements for a celebration, paying cash to avoid identification. That suggested someone knew in advance that the celebration would become a time of mourning." She sipped her tea before continuing. "Once I began investigating, the pattern became clear. Mrs. Hartwell's financial concerns, Dr. Fairfax's suspicious research, Major Pemberton's desperate circumstances, each element pointed toward a conspiracy that required Mrs. Hartwell's silence. And the poisoning itself, digitalis, was a clever choice. It could easily be mistaken for heart failure in an elderly person experiencing excitement and stress. But the timing was too precise to be natural, and the symptoms Dr. Haydock described were consistent with foxglove poisoning rather than cardiac episodes." Colonel Bantry shook his head in amazement. "To think they nearly succeeded. If Mrs. Hartwell had died, they would have blamed her for the missing money and continued their fraud indefinitely." "Indeed, Colonel, criminal enterprises often succeed because they exploit people's reluctance to suspect respected community members. We assume that education, social position and professional reputation guarantee honesty, but unfortunately, they can also provide excellent cover for sophisticated crimes." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hartwell herself, looking remarkably well for someone who had recently survived deliberate poisoning. She carried a bouquet of cheerful autumn flowers, a sharp contrast to the funeral arrangements that had begun this entire affair. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, "I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced. I wanted to bring you these flowers from my garden as a small token of gratitude." "How lovely, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm delighted to see you looking so well." Mrs. Hartwell settled into a garden chair with obvious pleasure. The doctors say I've made a complete recovery thanks to the quick medical attention I received, though I must admit, learning that my collapse was caused by deliberate poisoning was quite shocking. I imagine so. Have you been able to complete your investigation of the society's finances? Oh yes, and the scope of their fraud was even greater than I initially suspected. They had been systematically skimming money from every donation sale, creating false records, and manipulating our accounts for over 18 months. The total theft exceeded £15,000. Colonel Bantry whistled in amazement. £15,000. Good heavens, that would have bankrupted the society eventually. Indeed it would have, Colonel, but thanks to Miss Marple's intervention we've been able to recover most of the stolen funds. The forged books themselves have been confiscated as evidence, but their value as curiosities may actually exceed what Dr. Fairfax claimed for them as genuine articles. Miss Marple found this ironic justice particularly satisfying, so the society may actually benefit financially from their criminal enterprise. In a way, yes. Several museums have expressed interest in acquiring the forgeries for educational displays about authentication techniques. Dr. Fairfax's work was technically impressive, even if morally reprehensible. As the afternoon progressed and her visitors prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons of the case. The funeral flowers that had seemed so inappropriate at a golden anniversary celebration had indeed been prophetic, but not in the way their purchaser had intended. Instead of celebrating Mrs. Hartwell's death and their criminal success, they had marked the beginning of the end for Dr. Fairfax and Major Pemberton's elaborate deception. Miss Marple, Mrs. Hartwell said as she prepared to depart, I've been wondering what first made you suspicious of those funeral arrangements. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. I suppose it was the contrast, my dear. Beauty in the wrong place, formality where joy should have been, mourning where celebration was expected. In my experience, when people go to great trouble to create such dramatic contradictions, they usually have compelling reasons. And you trusted your instincts despite having no concrete evidence. Oh yes, Mrs. Hartwell. You see, I've learned that criminal behavior often reveals itself through small inconsistencies and inappropriate details. People planning crimes become so focused on the major elements of their deception that they overlook how their actions appear to observant witnesses. As her guests departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, watching the late afternoon light fade over St. Mary Mead. The case had been resolved, justice had been served, and the Literary Society would continue its valuable work under more careful financial supervision. But she knew that somewhere else, other criminals were probably planning similar deceptions, exploiting trust and expertise for personal gain. The techniques Dr. Fairfax had employed could be replicated by anyone with sufficient knowledge and motivation. The thought was sobering, but not discouraging. As long as there were people willing to observe carefully, ask questions, and trust their instincts about human nature, such crimes would eventually be exposed. And sometimes, the criminals themselves would provide the very clues, like inappropriate funeral flowers at a celebration, that would lead to their downfall. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she gathered up the tea things. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new observations, and perhaps new opportunities to see that justice was done. For now, it was enough to know that in this particular case, the funeral flowers had bloomed into the truth,